Wouldn't it be cool if there was a Netflix for finance? Well, there is. It's called Real Vision, and it gives you unprecedented access to some of the most respected names in finance. Watch interviews with legends like Kyle Bass, Jeff Gundlach, Stanley Druckenmiller, and many, many more. If you want to be part of the Real Vision revolution, visit realvision.com/WSO. Hi, you're listening to the Wall Street Oasis podcast, a podcast about breaking into the world of finance, along with interviews with those who have. I'm Alex Grodnick, and on today's show, the definition of persistence. Andre Bueno did not have the right background to break into Wall Street, but he made it happen. I think his story is inspiring for everyone trying to do the same, but it's not easy. Wait till you hear what he did. Also, the investment banking guide was a difference maker for Andre. After you listen to this episode, go check it out. Wall Street Oasis guarantees your satisfaction. All right, let's go. Andre, welcome.
Hey man, dude, I'm super excited. So it's funny because like when I was growing up, like Wall Street Oasis was really kind of like the main place that I would spend my time just trying to learn everything and anything that I could about like getting on the street. And it's kind of surreal because I mean on one hand, when I'm sitting there, I'm this like non-target school kid, I'm reading one of the Wall Street Oasis guides, and I'm really trying to basically go from not being on the street to getting on the street. That entire process is so kind of challenging, especially when you don't really have the right network. And it's awesome that there's a community such as Wall Street Oasis that it's out there for us.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the goal of this, is to kind of help share the network, share some success stories, some tips into breaking in. So you did break in. Love to hear your background, how you did it.
My first opportunity was, I spent about, I think it was 6 or 7 months just interviewing. And I probably did, I don't want to say about 50 or 60 interviews. And it's not that I'm like super great or super smart or anything like that. It's just being persistent. And I remember I'd walk into these interviews and I'm like, this is great. Like, they're totally going to allow me to just walk in the door because I'm the Brazilian guy. Like they need people like me. And then I'd show up and they're like 500 people, like way more qualified, that look just like me. And I'm like, oh shoot, I gotta really kind of step this up. And, it was such an interesting experience because when you get rejected like 50, 60 times, like when you finally do get that internship, for me, it was actually at Citigroup. I mean, there are a lot of unconventional ways that went into, getting, so many different opportunities, so many different interviews, and ultimately landing the job offer.
Right. So what was your main strategy? Were you looking at people on LinkedIn, figuring out their email addresses, sending them cold emails with something relevant? Here's who I am. I'd love to get an internship. How'd you do it?
I want to tell 4 stories today.
Okay.
All right. I want to tell you about how I got in touch with so many people, how I added 1,000 people on LinkedIn over the course of a summer. I want to talk about the, I guess, unconventional strategies you can use to break into Wall Street when interviews aren't available. I want to also talk about the, I guess, kind of different factors and things that are at stake when you're going into these interviews. And lastly, also want to talk about what happens when you get fired.
Okay. That sounds good. Let's go story number 1.
So this story starts out actually in Los Angeles. I'm going to Loyola Marymount, small little liberal arts school, and I'm trying to get actually access to, people in the Wall Street network. This is something that, besides reading a couple books and watching a couple movies, I didn't really know what was going on out there. But I'm sitting there and I'm reading through the forums, and I'd go into these interviews, and I'm just getting like obliterated. Like I'm walking out sometimes in tears, sometimes like actually crying. Like it was like not great. And it was interesting because I'd always go back to the forums, and I'm sitting there and I'm trying to get an idea of what have other people done, like how have they been successful, and I'm going through like the Wall Street Oasis guide, and I'm really trying to fill in the holes. And a lot of like my background is I just studied business. I'm not a finance guy. I'd go into these interviews and they're asking, walk me through a DCF. I'm like, I beg your pardon. So, I mean, getting the technical knowledge is just so critical. And also building that network's really important too. So I started thinking about, all right, like here are the different opportunities I want to pursue. And me being like a real estate guy, I said, I want to work at, the strongest banks that there are on the streets. And I'm going to go for any opportunity because at the end of the day, beggars can't be choosers. But at the end of the day, I figured, let me get my foot in the door, then I'll figure out how to kind of be able to proceed. And yeah, so I went around and just added a whole bunch of people on LinkedIn.
And so you're adding these people on LinkedIn. You're sending little messages on there. Hey, I'm Andre. Love to chat. Do you have 10 minutes? That kind of thing?
I did anything and everything you can think of. So nowadays, you can get there's this website. It's called Calendly. You can go and you can use this to basically like set up these little 20, 30-minute interviews. Like for me, back then, like when we didn't have something like that, I was just messaging saying, can I take you out for coffee? Do you have 10 quick minutes to chat? Mm-hmm. Like anything that I could to get in front of people. I would wake up at 4:00 in the morning on the West Coast and start calling banks so that before the traders started actually getting busy during their day on the East Coast, and then proceed through my day, go to college, do whatever. And then in like the evening, start calling like the Hong Kong desk and the Tokyo desk because I just wanted to get a job, man. And being that, I mean, it was competitive in 2010, 11, 12, right? It's even more competitive now. So in order to like really be able to position yourself, like your networking has to be good. Your technicals have to be good. It's just such a different environment.
So how'd you prepare for these interviews? Once you were able to get them on LinkedIn, technical stuff, how'd you get that?
Reading through the guides, and to be completely honest, it's going through the forums and figuring out like what other people were being asked, and just sitting there and not only trying to learn from other people's mistakes, but at the same time, I was failing a lot and failing really fast. And I think that's something that, I tell kids trying to break into the street all the time, if you want to go and get one of these opportunities, like you don't have to go after it. Like you have to chase it down. And if you're from a non-target school, or if you have something that, if you have anything short of like, call it a 3.8 GPA from, a top tier school, then you need to hustle, and you need to hustle a lot. I felt like I wasted a lot of time just trying to search for the content myself, right? I'm trying to put together like, what is a DCF and what is this and what is that? And, trying to read through different corporate finance books. And there's just like no one organized way of actually being able to get all that information. But then I pick up the guide, and all of a sudden it's just very clear. It's very organized. Everything's just well laid out. And I'm sitting there just thinking, if I had just invested in this guide 3 months, 6 months ago, it would have saved me a lot of time. And I think starting earlier rather than later, I think that's one of the biggest things, especially with this guide. Like it'll take you some time to be able to, get all this information, especially if you've never seen this material. But once you actually get past that hump and become, familiar with it, it should be second nature to you.
And you can get, but there are spots. There are these one-off spots. I did it, you did it. And so it can be done.
Oh, absolutely. I think I think it's even more doable nowadays just because you have so many different tools. What I was doing back then was very simple. I'd go on Google and I'd type in like Goldman Sachs analyst, and then I'd put in LinkedIn, and then like it spit out all like the different like people that are analysts at Goldman or were analysts at Goldman. And then I just started adding people, and everyone who I'd add, I'm like, hey, can I take you out for coffee? Can I do this? Can I do that? And I flew across the country to take people out for coffee. Wow. Just hoping that I'd be able to get, one step closer. And it's, if you have like having the technicals down, and this is something that I learned like along the way, it's having the technicals down gets you to the doorstep. After that, a lot of it's like, you have to have the personality. You have to be sure that you can understand like, the desk and have a compelling story and be able to have that all nicely wrapped up. And a lot of that happens when you really, really, truly understand exactly what you're interviewing for. And you understand, I guess more of like a macro environment of what's going on with that bank or that institution.
Right. Yeah. You got to have the whole package, the story, the technicals, the networking to begin with. It's all part of the process. So you end up getting an internship at Citi, you said?
Yep. It was a great summer. I worked in the equity capital markets desk. So that summer we took Pandora public. We also were working with Alley Financial, which was General Motors had like a financing arm that kind of went bankrupt during the crisis. And it was like a gigantic transaction. And then we also started working on Zillow at the time. So it was a very busy summer for us.
Cool. And so what were your takeaways from the summer? Did you go back there? Did it change the job you wanted? Where do you go from there?
Did not get a return offer.
Why?
Oh man, just bad analyst, man. No, it was my background was like I got placed on the equity capital markets desk covering Latin America and covering the States. And this is a time when Latin America started getting a little shaky. This is, call it 2011. At the same time, the domestic desk was actually getting shaky too, because now you have the government getting ready to shut down at the time. You have healthcare reform coming up on the bill. So the amount of spots that we had going into the summer versus what was actually offered was like getting diminished by the day. So with me not getting a return offer, I ended up basically having to go back to the drawing board and start over.
And so you did that, right?
Yep.
And where do you go from there?
Actually, I went to your campus. I went to UCLA. Even though I was going to school about 10 miles south, I would actually cut out of class and, attend any information session you guys had on campus. Anything that the undergrads had, your mechanical engineers would always host these investment banking nights, specifically for like masters of finance and things like that. So I'd go into every single one. I knew nothing about what I was talking about, but it was enough just to get in there and say, hey, like, I'd love to learn more about, Goldman Morgan. They're like, it's Goldman Sachs. And, and I ended up going to a number of different interviews. And it's funny because I would go back and I'm interviewing at the same desk that rejected me like the summer before. And I'm sitting there, and sometimes there were different people, and I'm noticing that, Wall Street's a game of musical chairs, right? And I'm seeing the same person that I was interviewing with, that was at Citi. Next thing you know, I'm interviewing with their desk at RBC, and I'm like, oh, crap, now I'm not going to get a job here either. So I had to think about something that I could do to really differentiate myself. And there was a presentation. Goldman actually showed up at UCLA to do a presentation on equity research. And I was doing a midterm, and I remember like asking the professor, I was like, hey, can I leave a little bit early? And what I ended up doing was I cut out of the midterm, got into my car, I drove up to campus. I'm like literally getting dressed on the 405 freeway, and I ended up parking like really far because I don't know, like UCLA is a lot bigger than.
The parking's the worst.
It's insane.
Yes.
And ended up parking like close to where like the fraternities are at, and having to like run across campus. And I show up, I'm like all sweaty, looking not great at all. Have like a resume and it's like mildly crumbled up, and I'm like, geez, I need to get my stuff together. And I show up to the room, and just like 2 summers before that, when I was at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, we actually went to UCLA to actually like interview a lot of the kids there. And I'm getting to see the kind of talent that UCLA is bringing to the table. And we're talking about kids who are going, doing their undergrad at UCLA and then going to like JPL or, some crazy like, aerospace defense company. And I'm like, man, these are the people I'm competing with. So I needed to do something to stand out. And I walk into the room and there are about, I'd say maybe 150 kids just all sitting down, everyone wearing suits. It was just exactly what you would think about. And with me kind of showing up late, I'm thinking, all right, the only way to differentiate myself is, if I do something that really kind of makes me stand out. And I'm thinking, I should ask a question. I should ask a question. I think that would be very, very appropriate. And I'm like, geez, this guy's talking a lot. So I was like, maybe if I just interrupt and I just, maybe no, that's probably not a good idea. So I just raised my hand. And now I'm standing in the back of the room. The guy's in the front of the room, and he's giving his presentation, and he's talking about his equity research group. And I turn to him, and I'm like, "Hey, like I'm really interested in equity research. This is something I'm really passionate about." And the guy, he was actually running a group that was doing equity research at Goldman in Salt Lake City, and he's like, if you're passionate about it, then tell me about a stock that you're very much interested in.
In front of everybody.
In front of everybody.
Yeah.
In typical Wall Street fashion, right? And I'm like, oh, crap. But luckily, I had failed an equity research interview the day before. So I had like a lot of information very fresh on my head. And one strategy I remember taking away was I always try to figure out who was presenting and what industry they were really, really a specialist of. And then I would talk about everything but that.
Right.
So he used to cover international paper. So I said, great. I'm going to talk to you about Chinese tech. I end up pitching him. He ends up liking the story. He comes down and says, look, we should have you talk to one of our recruiting specialists. We'll probably reach out, depending on your resume, about bringing you in for an initial screen. And even then I'm thinking, geez, I just put on a show in front of everybody. And, I just got to the screening point, and that's how competitive it is these days. Right.
Yeah.
So, ended up going through the interview process, got a job at Goldman, and started there after college.
That's awesome. That's a great story.
Thank you.
So you worked at Goldman. Now you have that on your resume. It's something everybody wants. Is it as good as it seems?
Yeah, until I got fired. It was great.
And why'd you get fired?
Being a bad analyst, like just didn't know the numbers, didn't have the technicals, wasn't particularly interested in the space I was in. I got placed on a LATAM consumer retail desk, and I wanted to do real estate, and I've always been the real estate guy. So getting pushed into an area, and I think it was an amazing experience because, look, working at a place like Goldman, it's one of the harshest and most like unforgiving work environments I think there is out there. Like the hours are extremely long. You're not allowed to complain about anything. You get built like a machine, which is great because your work ethic just becomes next level. But at the same time, there's also the culture component. And I think a lot of times when you're trying to get any position, you start thinking about it as, I need to get this job. Like I need to be working at this bank or at this institution, or this private equity fund or hedge fund or whatever. But then you realize, oh, well, you never look into the culture aspect. You never look at, who's actually working there. And the thing about, Wall Street is that it's all, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I think a lot of us get so focused on, if I don't get that job at Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley fresh out of college, then it's over. When a lot of times sometimes the best thing that could happen is that you don't end up at one of those banks and you end up going to a smaller shop and you get a lot of, great opportunities and you become that very technical and super savvy individual. So it was a great learning experience. I ended up moving on from that role, working. I jumped over to a real estate private equity fund, and we were doing like developments in Latin America. And on one hand, it was great because I'm actually getting to do the real estate stuff I wanted to do. On the other hand, I'm still stuck in the LATAM role, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I move on from this one? And if you really look at kind of like my career trajectory, like none of it makes sense. And it was just purely sales. It was just going from equity capital markets, so investment banking on the private side, to going to the public side, doing equity research, and back to the private side and private equity. And as I'm going through this, I'm realizing like just how important it is to have a community around you that will actually help you kind of get to that next level.
Right. And this is where your network of thousands of people on LinkedIn, you can start to see, who do I know that does real estate private equity? Start reaching out for round 2 coffees.
I drank so much coffee that I converted to decaf at one point.
Funny. So you said it that, your career is a marathon, not a sprint. You got this job at Goldman Sachs. A lot of people would say, oh my God, this is it. It's so great. For you, you said, oh, I'm not doing the real estate stuff. I'm not going to do a good job and get fired. If you had to do that again, would you have a different mentality going into that and say, okay, I'm not on the exact desk that I want to be at, but I'm at a great shop. I'll grind this out for a while and see if I can impress everybody enough that they'll let me transfer. Would you take that kind of outlook on it, or do you think you'd do the same thing that you did?
I would do the same thing that I did. I probably would have left earlier. And the only reason for that is like people should be, I think people, when people perform at really high levels, it's because they're doing something that they're really happy and passionate about. Right. And you have to buy into that thing that you're doing. So for me, it's when I was at Goldman and I was placed on a desk that I wasn't really that excited about, if I didn't have any other options, absolutely. Like I did some very interesting stuff. I covered very interesting companies. Actually, ironically enough, I covered all the companies that were like major like international supermarket and internet retailers in Latin America ex Brazil. So all I did was like I had a team in Sao Paulo. I covered everything in Chile, Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Mexico. It was an amazing experience, but I think you really should think about really kind of like that long-term, where do you want to be at? And sometimes you have to think about like what are the short-term goals that you need to achieve to get to that long-term kind of solution. For me, when I went into Goldman, I remember telling actually one of my parents, I told my mom, I was like, hey, I'm going to work here for like the next decade. Then I'm going to retire. It's going to be great. And then 5 months into it, I'm like, I'm not going to make it. And I think it's like disappointing for a lot of people that kind of realize that, like you go through that summer internship and you spend those 3 months on the desk and you're like, this is great. I could totally do this. It's like the summer times 4. But then after kind of like that month 5, month 6, and you start realizing like, okay, I need to start thinking about this strategically of like, how am I going to make it through the next 3 years? Then at that point, you really have to start analyzing like where you're coming from and, exactly kind of what career, I guess, you want for yourself.
Right. how did you analyze that situation? You thought, I need to do real estate. It doesn't matter that I'm at GS. I got to go do real estate.
It was one of those things where I remember spending a lot of time actually at GS reading all the real estate research reports. And I'm actually going and actually spending time on Wall Street Oasis and reading the real estate sections. And I'm there literally at my desk looking and seeing, who else is interviewing at different like real estate private equity funds and how are they doing it. And now I'm actually going back through the same process, now adding a whole bunch of people on LinkedIn. Now I can't take people out for coffee, but if I could hop on the phone with them for 10 quick minutes at any point in time that's convenient for them, then I'm totally going to take that up. So I just had to become scrappy and just trying to reinvent myself. And over time, I realized that I guess that was like one of the biggest takeaways that I really had. And I know we talked about like the number of different stories. I want to tell you 4 stories, right? I told you the first one about how I added everyone on LinkedIn. The second one was talking about how, I was kind of hopping around from, one position to another and, continuously like adjusting. And I think the third one was, when you've had such a fragmented like work history like I've had, where I do an internship one place, then I work at Goldman for a little bit of time, and I'm really trying to find my way. It really caused me to have to like be really like innovative and thinking like outside of the box when I'm looking for different opportunities. And I ended up actually going from the real estate private equity fund and hopping over to Morgan Stanley to go sell derivatives. And that was a interesting experience because that's something I've always wanted to do, because in my head, there were 2 things that I knew for sure I wanted to do real estate, but everyone said, you're going to be great at sales. You should go do sales. So I said, before I try, pursuing this real estate path, whether it's working for someone else or starting my own thing, I need to go do the sales thing. And I was really worried because I feel like the equity sales like position is actually, it's a dying industry. A lot of things are being automated. Electronic trading is becoming more and more like prevalent. So I ended up actually going to pursue an opportunity where I had 0 connections on the street on the sales side. And I said, all right, I got to start from scratch again. So that's what I did.
It sounds like you just love a challenge.
I think I had a friend turn to me actually about a year and a half ago. And he's like, when you were the happiest? He's like, when you were unemployed. He's like, it's not because you were hanging out all the time. It's because you loved interviewing.
You must be good at it by this point.
Well, it's the same. It's the same skill set that you use for, I guess, almost anything else in life. It's the same skill set you use for dating. It's the same skill set you use for, developing a new relationship. It's really just building rapport.
I'll let you have the last word if you want to leave listeners with any more. You've had tons of advice here, but any last thoughts, things that you want people to take away from this?
Yeah. I think as someone who's kind of gone through the non-target school kind of route, and me kind of looking back, like when I was in college, I feel like I spent a lot of time making excuses for why I couldn't do things versus actually going out and accomplishing them. So I'd spend more time sitting there and thinking to myself, well, if I had went to this Ivy League school, or if I had, rich parents, then X, Y, and Z thing would happen. But the reality is it's all hard work. It's just hustle. And that's the thing that I feel like really differentiated me from really like my peers. It's, you look at a lot of people, they're going to go and they'll do 3 or 4 or 5 different interviews. And if they get rejected, then, it is what it is. And, they're going to go and try to do something else. But then you also see those kids who have what Angela Duckworth would call grit. You know, they're just like, I'm going to get this job. It might take me 2 months. It might take me 2 years. And I have seen more and more success stories of people who, I had a friend who reached out to me while I was at Goldman, and she turns to me and says, hey, I'm really interested in working in investment banking. This is what I'd like to do. I'm working at this fashion company. I'm thinking, geez, I don't even know if Wall Street Oasis can help this girl. Like, this is intense. And she hustled. And next thing you know, about a year and some change later, she's like, you should come by my office. I work at this real estate private equity fund. And I'm like, holy crap. Like, she just completely skipped the banking route and just went straight for the good stuff. And so I think I've seen more stories of the impossible happening than I think that there's really anything's possible. It's just a matter of how hard do you want to work towards it.
I love that. Oh, did we get your fourth story?
So the interesting part was when I was working at that real estate private equity fund and I realized I really wanted to be in sales and I wanted to get a position. I mean, to be able to go through and explain going from a capital markets group to equity research, now to private equity, that took a lot of sales and maneuvering. And it really took a lot of time for me to really spend methodically analyzing like everything in my background. I needed my story to be coherent. I needed everything to make sense. I needed to pass the sniff test, because when I'm sitting there and they're looking at my background and they're seeing, you know, that fragmented work history, they're wondering what is going on with this guy. And at the time, like, there weren't a lot of jobs available. And especially being like a sales analyst, I mean, we're talking 1, maybe 2 positions are opening up, you know, per bank, call it every summer. A lot of it's going to like the interns or people that are internal. So we're talking to break into one of those positions. I'm competing with everyone who's in the job market right now, call it all the new grads. They're all the people that got laid off from all the different banks. And then there's this other third category is all these other people that are working inside of the banks that want to move from like a back office role to front office. So I'm sitting there and I'm trying to figure out, how do I get in touch with these people? And I needed to create some sort of, I guess, competition between the different banks, because there are not that many positions going out. And the last thing they want to do is think about the world of finance. Finance is all about controlling risk. And when you're looking at a candidate, you have a candidate in New York and you have a candidate in California. Who are you going to hire? You're going to hire the person in New York because you don't have the cross-country risk. You don't have the risk of this person deciding, I don't want to move. So for me to get over all these humps, it meant I had to really sit down and think through my story and say, you know, I'm already committed to moving here. Like, this is what I'm going to do. And being able to convince the bank really at the end of the table that this is something that was going to happen. So what I ended up doing was I called all my friends who I had interned with back at Citi and different friends who worked in the street. And I called them and said, hey, like, can I crash at your house? And mind you, these are all analysts. So they all have roommates and stuff. So I'm like literally crashing on, you know, my friends' floors. Some of them don't even have mattresses. And this is in October. So this is like my first like New York City winter too. And I'm just like, holy crap, this place is really cold. And I end up calling all these different banks. And the first one that I'm able to get in touch with was actually Credit Suisse had a foreign exchange kind of sales desk. And I called the guy, I ended up talking to this managing director, and I convinced him that, hey, I really want to go and sit down and grab coffee with him because, you know, I'm really interested and passionate about FX sales. And, you know, I give him my spiel, and the guy says, well, you know, maybe when are you in town? And I said, hey, I'm moving next week. Would love to see you. The reality is I booked a plane ticket and I was going to spend 10 days in New York. And I said, I'm going to use every single one of these 10 days to the fullest. As soon as I got off the phone with him, I go and I call HSBC and I'm like, hey, I just got this interview with Credit Suisse. It's going to be great. Would love to sit down with you guys. I'm really excited about HSBC. You guys are actually my number one choice. And then they said, no, sure, maybe. Why don't you, we're going to schedule, how about a preliminary phone call? And I'm like, sure, sounds good. And then I call up my friends at Barclays and I say, look, I got an interview at Credit Suisse. HSBC is hounding me about, hopping on the phone with them. But I'd love to really work at Barclays. I mean, it's, legacy Lehman Brothers. I think it's a great bank, the international component. I think there's just a lot of great things. So then Barclays says, oh, okay, sure. Why don't we have you go down to the LA office? We'll have you do a video screen and then we'll see if it makes sense. And I'm like, that's perfect. And then there was Morgan Stanley. I had actually done 17 interviews with this derivatives desk, back in 2011 when I didn't get my offer from Citigroup. And I interviewed with a whole bunch of people on the desk, went all the way up to the managing director. I did not end up getting that job offer. So now I'm going back to the same desk with the same people working, or mostly the same people working there. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, yeah, now I know derivatives. You should hire me now. And a lot of the people were, skeptical, and they're like, why should we talk to this guy again? And I end up telling them, I'm like, hey, I got an interview at Credit Suisse. I got some stuff going on with HSBC. I got to meet with Barclays next week in LA. So look, at the end of the day, I'd love to work at Morgan Stanley. That's just the reality. I worked at Goldman Sachs already. Going to Morgan Stanley would be great. And all I'm trying to do is just create that competition between the banks. So what actually ends up happening is actually I thought was the most interesting thing. So I end up flying out. Credit Suisse actually, they end up hiring someone from Goldman or something who was in the city. So I never even get that opportunity. And HSBC actually never ends up calling me. I ended up doing the interviews with Barclays, and I interviewed with them in LA before I left. And then I flew out there and I do this long super day with them. It's like a 2-day long process that never went anywhere. It wasn't rejected, wasn't not rejected either. It was just no one ever called me. And then all of a sudden, Morgan Stanley is like, yeah, no, absolutely. Like, if you want to join, we need you to join now. Can you move next week? And I'm like, give me a month. But I never would have gotten that opportunity if I hadn't set up all those different kind of cards along the way. And I think a lot of times, when you're sitting there and you're trying to look for an opportunity and you're like, all right, I want to go after the bulge bracket banks. I always tell kids, I'm like, go after the bulge bracket banks, go after the boutique banks, go after every middle market bank out there, and go after anything else in between too. Look at different verticals, look at different opportunities. At the end of the day, it's like you have to choose from what's available to you. So go out and see how much can you kind of gather, and then you figure out what's the best alternative from all those positions. Because if you want to do TMT banking at Goldman, but the only offer you got is public finance at, X, Y, and Z bank, then that option might not be available. But if you really exhausted it, maybe it's not TMT at Goldman, but it's TMT at, some boutique bank. That's just as good. And I think having industry experience is more important than, just having the brand name.
Enjoyed speaking with you. Thanks again.
Yep. Thank you.
And you've been listening to the Wall Street Oasis podcast. We have much more coming. Please stay with us.